I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 164th episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to build, preserve, and empower your brain, whether or not it actually works the way that you think it does. In this episode, we're going to be talking about placebo effects and sort of their inverted twin sister nocebo effects, how it is they work, why they might work, how we can use them to our advantage, and of course, what they are. You're probably familiar with placebo effects. This is the idea that oftentimes a person's response to any given input is based not only on what that input's doing physiologically, but their expectations and assumptions about what it will do. The not to be understated power of the mind over the body, all that stuff. Placebo effects get a kind of bad rap because oftentimes when we hear, oh, well, those are placebo effects, we think that means it's not really working, that's not really doing anything. One of the many nuanced ideas that we'll be talking about here is that even things that actually do have physiological effects also have placebo effects layered on top of them oftentimes because that expectation is there, particularly if we have prior experience with something, then we know it's going to do something physiologically. Anyway, in the main interview, we're going to be talking all about placebo with Dr. Tor Wager, so stay tuned for that in just a couple of minutes. Also, if you're listening to this right as we publish, then tomorrow, that is January the 21st, is National Hugging Day. A little known holiday, but a good one. And to celebrate National Hugging Day, we're going to be talking about some of the psychology related to hugs and how various technologists are trying to take advantage of that in the ruthless listener retention gimmick. That'll be at the very end of the episode, but for right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So sometimes scientific researchers really just throw a bone to Hollywood producers who are thinking of what's the concept for the next big horror movie or sci-fi disaster flick, doing some research where you don't have to be terribly creative to think, wow, this could go completely sideways and kill a lot of people. You'll probably remember the movie 28 Days Later, one of the fast zombie flicks from, I guess this was the early 2000s when that movie came out, where the premise of the movie was that they were investigating rage, and they came up with a virus that could be passed from one animal to another with a bite that would apparently make the amygdala go into overdrive, something like that, and make you want to kill everybody around you in a zombie-esque frenzy. This research is a little bit the real-world version of that. It does deal with the amygdala. This was recently published in the journal Cell, and researchers were looking at some of the deep neurological structures that are apparently available in all vertebrates. These are some common and evolutionarily conserved things that have been with us for a long time. One thing vertebrates tend to have in common are necks and jaws, and as it turns out, amygdalas, the portion of the brain that's involved with fight or flight, emotions like rage, anger, the impulse to kill things, stuff like that. And although you might kind of think that things fall by the evolutionary wayside if they're not used for a long time, like if an animal has been herbivorous for a long time and doesn't really need to hunt and kill animals, you'd kind of think that maybe the predatory kill instincts might not be there anymore. But it turns out you would be wrong because scientists have teased apart using optogenetics how to turn friendly little innocuous-seeming lab mice into vicious killers. So optogenetics, you probably remember from past episodes, is using implanted lights inside an animal's brain to trigger specific brain regions. In this case, they were investigating areas in the amygdala, and they found two related but distinct areas that they could stimulate, one of which caused hunting and predatory behavior, and the second of which was basically an on switch to make the animal bite, kill, and go for the jugular, quite literally. So mice, not vicious killers, but by triggering these two areas, they could make the mice attack bottle caps and inanimate objects, things like that. Basically, it turned the mice into these crazy killing machines, said the study's lead investigator, Ivan Diarrajo of the Yale University School of Medicine. We'd turn the laser on and they'd jump on an object, hold it with their paws, and intensively bite it as if they were trying to capture and kill it. The animals didn't go completely insane, though. This isn't like an insanity switch because it didn't make them attack members of their own species. If you happen to be a cricket in the mouse cage, though, you were gonna die. The ferocity of the attack did seem to be affected by how hungry the animal was. They could get an attack response even from a non-hungry animal, but if the animal was hungrier, it would just be all that much more ferocious, or as ferocious as a mouse can be. The researchers also proved fairly conclusively that these really are two distinct systems, the hunting versus the killing systems in the brain. If they lesioned the neurons associated with the biting and killing, the mice would pursue their prey. They would hunt it, but they couldn't kill. The biting force of the jaw was reduced by 50%. As Diarrajo says, they failed to deliver the killing bite. Now that these two systems have been successfully teased apart, the team is looking at how they're actually coordinated in a brain in a live animal. Perhaps tempting fate, Diarrajo says, we now have a grip on their anatomical identities, so we hope we can manipulate them even more precisely in the future. Enter Hollywood screenwriter stage left.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews for the podcast on iTunes. Listener Cameron JP says, listening to your show is always interesting and it makes the workday go by quickly. A few of the episodes have even triggered some great conversation between a couple of coworkers and myself. Well, hopefully even your boss is happy about you and your coworkers discussing ways to improve all of your brains while at work. And listener Win617 from the UK says, what fascinating subjects covered on this podcast, all focusing on one domain, how to improve your cognition. I downloaded and listened to all the previous episodes and now I have to wait a week for the new episode. Yeah, sorry about that. That's the bummer about getting to the end of something. But we are nowhere near the end of this podcast. We just had our 4-year-old birthday, which I kind of wish we'd done a little bit of a bash for, but I didn't realize it until a couple of weeks after it had happened. So one thing that should have helped me with my memory, although possibly that was more long-term memory failing than short-term memory failing, is aniracetam, which is something that I get in my system almost every day with my use of Nexus. Nexus and mitogen are the two supplement stacks that we've got over at axonlabs.io. Axon Labs, the retail wing of operations here at Smart Drug Smarts. As well as aniracetam, Nexus includes complementary ingredients CDP choline, phosphatidylserine, and pycnogenol. I think we've had episodes on 3 of those 4 compounds individually if you go back in the Smart Drug Smarts library. But it's a nice overall cognitive stack, something that perks you up a bit, but it's not going to rev you up so much you can't go to sleep later. I find it useful as both an alertness kick and a bit of a creativity enhancer. Somebody emailed me recently and said, how do you compare Nexus to modafinil? I take 800 milligrams of modafinil a day, and I sputtered a bit. I didn't have a ready answer for that one. 800 milligrams of modafinil is a lot. I think if I ever took 800 milligrams of modafinil, I would run straight through a wall and leave a Bugs Bunny silhouette hole behind me. I've taken 200 milligrams at a time, and even that feels a little bit druggy for me. There probably is a comparison to be made, but my default answer with nootropics is typically just to give things a try yourself, see how they feel for you, because the person-to-person effects of each one do have quite a bit of variance. I found that aniracetam really hits the spot for me, but it might be something else for you, so it's definitely worth sort of testing around. But if you are curious about either Nexus or mitogen, you can find both of those online over at axonlabs.io. Also, a little reminder, we've got the Smart Drug Smarts newsletter, which we call the Brain Breakfast. If you haven't signed up for that yet, that is over at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. And we would very much love to have you there. Going to be sending out another one of those in the next day or two, actually trying out a new email system. Very, very early spring cleaning here in 2017, but prepping for a lot of good stuff coming in the next couple of months. But anyway, that is all I've got in the way of announcements, so let's move on now to the main interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So we are about to be speaking about placebo effects. I'm going to be talking with Dr. Tor Wager from the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Colorado at Boulder. His lab does a lot of work looking at clinical disorders, including PTSD, depression, schizophrenia, and chronic pain, and trying to develop effective therapies for those conditions. The treatment of pain and the use of placebo has gone hand in hand for a long time. There have been a lot of studies there, and so looking at placebo has been a big part of Dr. Wager's work. We actually had an episode of placebo very early in the history of this podcast, episode 20, talking with another luminary in the field of placebo research, Dr. Fabrizio Benedetti. That one might be worth referring back to also, but I kind of wanted to brush up the topic. This is an area of ongoing research. There's really kind of a lot to be looked at and figured out in the area of placebo. I think this is a subject matter that probably gets more respect in science than it does sort of in the mainstream public. When you talk to the man on the street about placebo, he kind of thinks placebo is a nice way of saying bullshit, that there's nothing really there. But in fact, placebo effects are really part of the response to any active medical intervention, as well as sham medical interventions, what we think of as a quote-unquote placebo. Placebo effects are there, whether a placebo is actually there or not. Placebo, by the way, if you're a Latin fan, comes from the phrase, I shall please, as in I shall make you happy. So obviously a placebo is inherently positive by definition. The opposite of that, a nocebo effect, is when a person's negative expectation about some given intervention or phenomenon causes it to have a more negative effect than it otherwise would. We'll be talking about both in the coming conversation. So with no further ado, let's jump in with Dr. Tor Wager.
I've had an interest for a long time in what our minds can do to help heal our bodies. So I grew up around a lot of people who really believe in spirituality to affect healing. Mm-hmm. And I guess the whole time growing up, I really wanted to know what's the truth in that. I think the mind can be a powerful thing and it can have effects, but it can't affect everything. You can't wish away or pray away your need to eat, breathe, drink.
Right.
But at the same time, I grew up around a lot of people who had very strong beliefs about the power of healing and the power of the mind to heal. And they did very well. I think a lot of people were very healthy. And so I've had this interest in what can we do with our minds, with our beliefs and our thoughts, and what kind of control do we have over our health outcomes. And so that translated into studying neuroscience into the study of placebo effects first. The nice thing about a placebo treatment is it's a sham treatment, so there are no active ingredients. It has effects by influencing the person's mind and brain. So that's a great window into studying what the effects are of changing somebody's mind. So placebo effects, this very broad umbrella that covers lots of kinds of changes. Condition changes, learned responses, changes in emotional state, changes in other neurochemical states, and changes in your expectations and beliefs and in sort of higher order brain systems. So all those things are at play in placebo effects. So it's a large family of effects.
Yeah.
The most powerful placebo responses are where you have these systems working together. You can have a sort of belief system. Let's say it's associated with your prefrontal cortex primarily. That's where beliefs start. And also these plasticity in brainstem circuits that are learning to respond to environmental demands. And so one way of thinking about it is your brainstem is continuously learning about the environment and what to do now. And your prefrontal cortex, your belief system, is saying, what's relevant? What should I be learning? What should I be taking away from this situation? So you have a headache, you take a pill, and the headache goes away. So you're going to learn something from that. But what are you going to learn? Are you going to learn that, hey, this pill is great, it worked? Mm-hmm. Or would the headache have gone away anyway? You might think, oh, well, headaches just go away after an hour. And this headache took 2 hours to go away. Maybe the pill is bad.
Right.
So there's this process of attribution. So your belief system is going to help shape what you learn about. And it can instruct the rest of your brain, which then learns and stamps in, or these responses that are relevant become more and more automatic. So the recipe for placebo effects in general would be something like you have a prior expectation of benefit. And then you get it from a drug, and you get experiences that confirm that.
Let's say I'm getting an additional placebo effect from caffeine. For example, when people smell their coffee in the morning, the smell of coffee doesn't actually wake you up, except for the placebo effects that might go along with it. But I'm wondering how much of the wakefulness results that wind up happening are typically coming from the compound versus from the expectation of the effect.
Right. If you take your morning coffee, then the smell of the coffee can wake you up. And there's really two things that can happen. One is it can wake you up in the sense that you know that this coffee is coming, and those are cues. The routine of preparing it, where you are, the look of the machine. I watch the espresso drip out of my espresso machine in the morning. Those things are really powerful cues, and your brain has learned to associate that with the coffee coming. Now, and that can play out in two different ways. One is it can mimic the coffee effect essentially in advance, right? It can wake you up. But the other thing that can happen is an opponent process, where it can put you to sleep, it can make you less aroused. And that's because what your brain is essentially trying to do as you get these cues that says, here comes coffee, or here comes food, or here comes a drug, is compensate.
Maintain an equilibrium.
Yeah. So there's a really neat series of studies. Ramsey and Woods wrote a review that I love on this some years ago. And in rat studies, if the rat gets a cue that says, here comes food, like eating a meal, when the rat eats chow and it knows it's eating it, all that, the taste and the feeling in the mouth and all that are cues. And those cues are learned so that when the rat anticipates eating a big meal, then there's anticipatory insulin release that helps promote metabolism and take sugar out of the bloodstream and store it. And if you deliver the same food without those cues, you inject it right into the rat's stomach, then the rats can't tolerate that. They go into a coma. And that's because there's no anticipatory process that compensates. So in many cases, what our brains are doing is continually trying to predict what's going to happen to us and therefore what the demands are on us or what we should do. And so sometimes that produces this sort of equal and opposite reaction.
You're saying it can kind of go either way in opposite directions. What tends to be the deciding factor as to whether we get an additive effect or a compensatory effect in the other way?
We don't know.
Wow, that's a big question mark.
I think it's a mystery. I think there's some things that can be said, but there's really a lot. It's really unknown about that. If you think about placebo painkillers, there's a mystery here. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, they really do work. If you believe that you're taking a drug that's going to influence your pain, going to reduce your pain, it's going to go down. And we can show that corresponding changes in the brain, in some cases, reproduce that effect or consistent with that effect.
Yeah.
So pain processing can change in the brain and the spinal cord. If you believe that the drug's going to make you worse, that's a nocebo effect, and you feel more pain.
Right.
If other people thought this thing was really bad, really painful, you're going to report it as more painful. And your skin will sweat more. Your autonomic responses will be stronger to that stimulus if you believe that other people think it's painful. And so there's all these influences, and they follow your expectations. If you believe that you're going to have more pain, you feel more pain. If you believe you're going to feel less pain, you feel less pain. And that's very strong. It's very reliable. And so is it the case that you don't do the opposite, right? If you believe that you're going to get very strong pain, your brain might also mount an anti-pain response.
Right.
And that happens in a series of rat studies. So if you expect really, really bad shock, your brain will likely release opioids, which are natural painkillers. So how do you reconcile these things? We found in an earlier study that when you get a placebo and you expect less pain, you release opioids. So that's the mystery. One answer here is it depends on how strong the threat is. And the principle is we have to stop thinking about this is, does the placebo do something? Does it mimic the drug effect, or does it oppose the drug effect, or whatever? What we have to start thinking about is, what is the situation that my brain is conceiving of?
Right.
And what's the likely best response in that situation? But I say, this is a placebo. It's really going to be helpful. It's a powerful painkiller. It's going to reduce your pain. And you really believe me, then that pain is less relevant for you. You evaluate that pain as less significant. So you can say, okay, well, I don't have to worry about that so much. I can focus on other things. And the pain goes down. And if I were to tell you now, I'm going to hook you up to a car battery, give you a really bad shock. This is going to be crazy bad. And you're scared out of your mind. What do you need to do? You need to escape, fight, flee, defend. And your brain is then going to say, hey, this is a serious threat. I better do something about that. Stewing about how much pain I'm in right now isn't so great. We need to turn the pain down and cope the situation.
That's really interesting. If that's the way that it works, that there's almost some sort of rational threat analysis process that's taking place subconsciously. I mean, that's like the Freud's superego or something like that. That's amazing that there's a choice-making mechanism there that's outside of conscious control.
Yeah. A lot of the work that we've been doing on placebo over the past years, a lot of the early work that we did over the past decade was establishing that placebo effects are real in brain, and they release opioids, they change brain activity. And lately, we've been focusing on this idea that your brain is forming a conception all the time about the situation that it's in. So it's putting the pieces together and saying, where am I? Who are the actors here? What's going to happen to me? And so it's more complex than pulling a lever. I mean, we have, let's say, on the order of 100 billion neurons in the brain, 10,000 synapses connected to thousands of other neurons. It's not like a series of levers. So there really isn't just like you get the placebo, the opioids turn on, the pain turns off. Those mechanisms exist, but what we need the big brain for is to understand which circumstances and situations we need to pull these different levers in different ways. I think of it a lot more now as a pattern recognition problem. So partly in our conscious awareness, but partly outside of our conscious awareness, our brain is conceiving of complex situations and adapting our responses accordingly. And by responses, I mean our physiology and our perception, as well as decision-making and our conscious thoughts.
I got a question actually quite recently, and basically somebody was asking whether they could self-induce placebo. This is a guy who has problems with headaches, and he wants to try to take a headache medicine, but start slowly taking less of the actual medicine and mixing in placebo with it, and kind of wean himself that way. If he knows what's going on, is there still any likelihood of that working, or does he need to kind of have another actor that can shield the mechanism from him?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The traditional wisdom is that you need to be fooled. You need to really believe that you're taking a real medication. But there's a series of studies recently on what they call open label placebo effects, which is a placebo that you know is a placebo. And that's sort of a mystery because we know from a lot of work, really, that your expectations are really critical. So if I say, hey, I'm going to give you a drug and this is really a placebo and there's nothing in it, but it's going to help you. And there's several studies that show that people get better with back pain, for example, with this open label treatment and irritable bowel syndrome. Then why is that happening? You might still need to really believe that it's going to help you, even if you don't believe that there's an active drug.
Right.
And so there's a question, can you actually fool yourself into thinking that or really believing that in a profound enough way? I don't know the answer to that. I think it's an interesting thought experiment.
It's kind of like tickling yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one thing we know, there are a lot of things that we can do that use the same mechanisms, broadly speaking, as getting a fake pill. So there are various kinds of reframing and reappraisal, refocusing of our attention and our thoughts that can make a big difference.
Do you have a concrete example you can pull out for that? Because I think that's a great point.
Yeah. If you just go back to the idea of threat and safety, let's say I tell you we've gone into your bank account, somebody's broken in, they've taken all your money, and nothing happens, right? You go like, yeah, whatever, I don't believe you. And I pull up your account, say, log in, pull up your account, and you see your account and you see that it's really true, then you'll respond, right? Your heart rate is going to go up, your pupils are going to dilate, you're going to generate a measurable physiological reaction. And that is your conception telling the rest of your autonomic nervous system and the rest of your brain what to do, right? And it really is based on your belief. So now if I said, well, you can consciously reappraise that. So what would you do? Well, you can choose to either completely panic and go, that's it, my life savings, or you can say, well, I'll probably get it back. There's recourse. I'm not going to worry yet. It's probably not so bad. Or you can say it's probably a hoax. It's probably not true. Or, oh, well, I have insurance for this kind of thing. So you can choose the thoughts to help shape what your emotions are. So this whole problem was created because of your appraisal, right? You believed something that was going to impact you.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. You're right. You're going to have this giant fight or flight response, despite the fact that there's nothing to fight or actually physically flee from.
Yeah. And so it just shows you how abstract, in some ways, the drivers of our emotions can be, where people prepare a speech in front of an audience, and that's very stressful for people. And that's also because of how they conceive of the situation. There's a person who's an expert there, the person is evaluating them, they're judging them. People don't like to be judged. It's a threat to their self-esteem. And so their bodies respond. Heart rate goes up, skin conditions goes up, brain activity in some of the same systems we think are involved in placebo painkillers, placebo analgesia, also affected by these stressors. And it's a pathway, from the prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, to the brainstem, periaqueducta gray, which is important for emotion generation and pain control, and then down to the heart, in this case, is a relevant pathway, and your heart rate goes up. So that's a conceptual threat. And when you reappraise or reevaluate what that means, and people will do this spontaneously, you're like, well, this isn't real. It doesn't matter what they think. That's a kind of thought that you can choose to emphasize. So we choose thoughts all the time to emphasize and bring to the forefront of our mind. And those thoughts have an impact. So I think if you go back to the painkiller example, we, as in our conscious agent, right, the person who seems to be making the decisions, we're subject to information that's coming up in our brains that, appraisals that are happening.
Yeah, it's kind of like which of the little voices in your head do you actually listen to?
Exactly, yeah. If you experience pain, a really important question is, what does that pain mean? And there's some automatic, well-learned associations we have with that. Depending on your background and who you are and what your personality and history is, you might completely freak out and think, oh, this is intolerable. At some level, your brain's saying, this is never going to end. This is a sign of damage. This is a sign that there's going to be problems later. I could be dying. I could be something, right? And some of us have those things just happen spontaneously, and other people not so much. And on top of that, we have some ability to choose these thoughts.
Yeah.
So when you have chronic pain, one of the big problems that patients suffer from with chronic pain is the attachment of negative emotional significance, negative thoughts about the future, perceived disability, and then the consequences of that are avoidance with social withdrawal from activities, withdrawal from things that are beneficial, and there's a spiral of disability.
Yeah.
So the therapies that people do are focused on changing your appraisals, so bringing certain thoughts to the forefront. And those thoughts might be, hey, it's just pain. You give a way to understand it, right?
Yeah.
In some cases, this pain, if it's in your back or your knee or whatever, doesn't mean that you should avoid doing that, avoid anything that hurts, because it's just pain. It's now your brain has taken over and is hyper responsive. It's creating this strong response and strong sort of negative significance. And what you need to do is unwind that and just realize it's just pain, and you can do those things anyway.
There are situations like being maybe sore after a good workout at the gym where pain can be viewed positively. You're like, yeah, that's the pain that I want to have.
Exactly. And over time, we come into this world with a kind of a natural set of predispositions to see, let's say, pain as more or less bad or more or less threatening for the future, more or less something to be feared. And the same with public speaking. But we all come in with a healthy fear of public speaking for the most part. We all come in with a healthy fear of pain for the most part. And then on top of that, we have some ability to choose our thoughts. But what I've come to believe is that we don't have 100% ability to choose our thoughts right now. So the example of the person who wants to give himself a placebo and make himself better, can he really deceive himself profoundly that his body's going to respond as though it were real? If you're sitting there, could you imagine that your building is on fire right now in a way that's so profound that you would react just the same as if there were a real fire? Probably not. So we have a limited capacity capacity for control of our beliefs in any moment. But over time, the beliefs that are habitually reinforced are strengthened. And I believe also if we exercise our capacity for self-regulation, then our capacity also grows. So if we choose to catastrophize about pain, if we choose catastrophic thoughts, then those thoughts become more automatic over time. But if we unwind that spiral of negative thoughts and we can choose thoughts that are a little bit more positive than before, those more positive associations and appraisals become more automatic. And if we practice that often, then we start to realize that we do have and we can gain more control.
I'd like to talk a little about the demographics of the placebo effect and how placebo is something that some people sort of are high responders to or are more likely to get a major change in their perceived scores on things, whereas other people not so much. And just kind of like what we know about that and the differences in the population as far as placebo effects.
Yeah, it's a really complicated question of who's a placebo responder and can you predict who's going to be a placebo responder? And that's one of the questions I've been working on over the last years. If you go back to almost 100 years, let's say, of studies of the placebo effect, if you go back to studies in the 60s and 70s and 80s, people really thought of placebo as a fake treatment for a fake illness. So if you get better on placebo, it must not have been a real illness in the first place.
Right.
Which I think is not true. I'm going off your question, but I wanted to make that point that you can have a real illness, but your brain has real effects on that real illness. There's a neurochemistry that contributes to that or helps to mitigate it. And so if you take a placebo, you can have a real effect on a real illness. So going back to the question you asked about individual differences in placebo, that's the sort of background. I mean, really for hundreds of years, no, more like thousands of years, physicians have been giving placebo treatments to their patients in order to make them feel better. And they figure then in the 1800s, if a person is hysterical, usually a woman, they can't understand what's wrong with them. They have lots of pain, lots of emotional problems, lots of other things like that. And they go, well, you're hysterical. We're going to give you a placebo. It'll make you feel better. And they figure if the placebo works, then it must not have been real, and that can soothe the nerves of the patient. So that's kind of been the background. Okay, go back to studies in the 60s, 70s, 80s. People were looking for associations with personality. And so in some of those studies, the people who are the placebo responders are the more neurotic people. And that was partly the way people looked at this, and that hasn't really held up. And so funny enough, recent studies, a whole wave of them, has looked at placebo effects, has started to think about placebo effects as a much more positive thing. In a sense, can you generate this response, the power of the mind and all that stuff? And when people look for personality correlates, a number of studies have found correlations with optimism. And so we're in this funny zone where personality correlates, it's been really hard to come up with very stable predictors. The old story was that you're neurotic or something, and now the new story is, hey, maybe it's those people who are the most optimistic.
I'm guessing that there probably would be a positive correlation between people that are placebo responders and people that are susceptible to hypnosis, that are good hypnosis responders. Is there any truth to that supposition?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that there's a relationship between the two, and there's a relationship between placebo or suggestibility in studies. But I feel like being hypnotizable is potentially more complicated. I haven't seen good data that shows that, it's just the hypnotizable people that show the largest placebo effects. So there are these personality correlates that people are finding, but they're not always stable across situations and types of placebo treatment. So it probably depends a lot on how a particular person responds to a very particular suggestion or treatment. So if you think about hypnosis, that's one set of suggestions. You lie back on the couch, you're feeling heavy or you're feeling light, and you start making these suggestions. And, a certain set of people can really get into that and allow themselves to be influenced by that. And other people are going to be more skeptical.
That's a great point. I mean, because you could really see where that would play out. Like, if I got a placebo treatment in official, respectable-looking doctor in like a nice, shiny hospital versus somebody doing voodoo in a swamp or something, they could both be placebo, but one of them I'm going to be much more likely to believe. And I'm the same person in both cases. Like, my personal level of placebo suggestibility hasn't really changed, but the environment that I'm responding to has changed a lot.
Exactly. Perfect example. So it's a lot about with a particular situation. So some studies have shown that a person who responds responds to a placebo pill won't respond to a placebo cream necessarily. Or in one study, if you give a placebo cream but you change the name of the placebo cream, that changes who responds.
That almost brings up like an interesting potential future line of products like designer placebos, like a company that would do some research to design a placebo that would be best for a person based on their preferences and personality characteristics.
Right, exactly. If you know what people find to be, convincing or safe, and you can even think about it as a marketing related problem.
Yeah.
If you could tailor something that really touches on something for each person, then that would be great. But of course, it's really hard to do that because we're so different in that way. So it's a lot about the situation. Now, there's a kind of dilemma in placebo research that I think is really interesting. So there's evidence that it depends a lot on the situation, the particular kind of treatment, the particular kind of outcome that you're looking at. Is it pain? Is it Parkinson's disease? Is it one kind of pain? Is it just heat pain on your arm, or is it labor pain from childbirth? There was one famous study, it was a terrific study by Lieberman in the 60s, and he studied women, 60 women or so, across 3 different kinds of pain. And one of them was actually labor pain and childbirth.
Yeah.
And what he found was placebo responses in all 3 of those areas, all 3 types of pain, but they were uncorrelated. So a person who is a responder in one situation is not a responder in another situation.
Wow.
On the other hand, if you keep the situation constant, so everybody gets the same cream, the same kind of treatment, the same situation, then placebo effects can be reliable. They can be reproducible across time. A person who's a high responder one time is a responder a month or 2 months or something later. And there are also stable correlates. So there's correlates, like I mentioned before. Optimism is one that's been found in a number of studies, and we've published work on that as well. You can think of it as a kind of behavioral activation, high engagement kind of people who perhaps have a high dopaminergic tone or response, a person who's suggestible, a person who's actually low in anxiety in our work and others recently. That's this kind of phenotype.
Let me flip that around. Does that hold the other way too, where a nocebo effect, sort of the negative version of placebo, would be positively correlated with pessimism?
That's a great question. I don't know. There's work on that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that would be the mirror image, and I was just wondering if there's data there.
Yeah, nocebo effects are less well studied, so that's a good thing to test out, right?
Yeah.
Does a high engagement, optimistic kind of person, are they just more influenceable, right, for better or worse? There's some work in psychology that suggests that might be the case. Just more open to information,
right,
more trusting of what they hear. Or is it that they're susceptible particularly to placebo effects, and nocebo effects would have a different personality profile?
Right.
There's also some genetic correlations having to do with variants in dopamine genes is one of the things that's been published. And there's even a company that's been started to capitalize on that and to try to develop a genetic test for placebo responders, because it's so important to know and to either screen people out or control for that in clinical trials.
Talk a little about that. That's an interesting point, how pre-screening of placebo-prone individuals really makes a big difference in, like, I guess not drug design, but drug development and testing.
It could. I think there's been a lot of interest over decades in trying to identify those placebo responders and screen them out ahead of time in clinical trials. And that's because so many clinical trials fail, even with potentially effective treatments, because the placebo response rate is really high. And often the drug versus placebo difference is then very small. And in pain, there was a recent meta-analysis that shows that the difference between drug and placebo is actually shrinking over time. So more trials are failing now, and the placebo response rate is going up, but the drug effect is not going up.
Wow, that's interesting. I mean, is that like society is getting more suggestible? What should we take that to mean?
They think it has to do with a couple of things. It's unknown, but one of the factors is that these trials have gotten longer and more involved with more monitoring, more care, especially in the United States. And so the level of general supportive care, monitoring, follow-up by expert people who care about what's happening with you is higher. And placebo effects are going up accordingly. So that's one of the explanations. In Europe, you don't find that effect, and you don't have the same kind of changes in trials, as I understand it. And also in the US, especially, we have direct-to-consumer marketing. So patients might be much more sort of clued into particular treatments that are being studied, and the promise of that particular treatment was new and more hopeful about that. So it's unclear why these effects are happening, but they are happening. And so there's a great need to control for the placebo effects. And people have been trying really for decades in clinical trials to do a placebo washout. So you take the placebo responders at the beginning and you get rid of those people and you test the remaining people.
Yeah.
And that has not worked well.
Well, yeah, you could see where if there really is like a demographic of higher responders, and that correlates with something, even if we don't know what that something is at a biological level, if you get rid of all those people, that you might be not seeing drugs that would affect those people that have a specific biology to them.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the problems. I think there's two reasons why this strategy hasn't worked well. And one is that the placebo response can be variable across time and situations. So just because you show a drop in the first 2 weeks of a study, antidepressant, right, because of the placebo, it doesn't mean that 6 weeks later you would have also showed the big drop.
Right.
And so it's just the variability. And the second thing is that because a lot of these drugs might interact with our beliefs and our brain processes, then if we screen out the placebo responders, we're also screening out the drug responders.
Yeah.
And it might be the case that you need the right kind of expectation and the right kind of mindset supported by the right drug, if the drug is effective, in order to get a response. Antidepressant, it's not just that, antidepressants just work and just make you non-depressed. I mean, depression is a complex response to one's environment that involves appraisals and beliefs and mindset and how you think about the future and how you evaluate yourself. And so the drug can't, even in principle, just go in and zap those negative thoughts out. But what they could potentially do is support changes that are driven by person's reevaluation of their situation over time. It's a big issue, right? And so then this business of trying to find a genetic profile or a personality profile or a brain pattern that predicts placebo responses is important, but it's also challenging to do in a way that will kind of scale up to what we need it to scale up to in clinical trials in a broad population.
What do you personally want to be taking a look at in your own studies next? What's sort of next on your hit list for some of these remaining questions?
So one of the things that we hit on is this issue of what is a placebo responder. We've done some work and we're hoping we can do more work to identify that. And even if there are many complex factors about the situation, we think that if you have the right kind of expectation in the right situation, you'll show particular kinds of brain responses. And those kinds of brain responses will predict your placebo response rate, or how strong your placebo effect is.
Yeah.
And we can look at brain activity and which brain systems are involved. We can look at neurochemistry and look at how that interacts with pharmacology. That's one area that's really important. Another area is continuing to pursue the issue of how deeply placebo effects can influence your pain, your Parkinson's disease, depression-related processes, and to what degree are they more superficial changes in judgment, and you're sort of fooling yourself, or you're just sort of going along, hey, this thing is going to make you feel better, and you go, oh yeah, okay, I feel better now. And the truth is that the overall placebo response, if I tell you you're going to get a painkiller, it's going to be awesome, and here comes the pain, and you report a big pain relief, then part of that is you going along with what I want you to say, potentially. Part of it is you changing your evaluation of the pain. You have the same experience, but it's like, oh, well, maybe it does really hurt less. I don't know. Yeah, So it's a decision-making effect. Part of it, in some cases, can be a deep influence on pain physiology. So when we just look at people's reports, it's a mix of these different things. And we'd like to pull that apart and figure out when, under what circumstances, do people show these very deep effects? And can we isolate those?
Yeah.
So that's what we're trying to do in part by we're looking at brain patterns that relate to pain physiology, among other things. We've done some work with Parkinson's disease as well, which is interesting. But if you look at pain, we know a lot about pain physiology. So we're trying to pinpoint what is it in the brain that's most closely associated with the incoming pain signals. How do these things get turned into pain? And then how do placebo effects influence those things? And once we have physiological measures for pain-related processes in your brain, then we can ask the question again about, well, what predicts it? If you're optimistic, is that good? If you have kind of high comp genotype or whatever, is that good? We can ask a lot of the same questions that we've been asking, but we can ask that in relation to this meaningful physiological measure. And I think that's going to help us move forward. And we can also say, look, what kinds of situations? If I just give you a pill and say, hey, this is great stuff, is that enough to work for people? And I think that that's probably not true either. I think what's going to happen is we're going to see that we need the right kinds of suggestions to people, but we also need to reinforce that with experience. So give their brain some training that it's effective, and then we'll see more profound changes in physiology. So the big area is, do placebo effects work in a very deep way in terms of affecting physiology in the brain, and under what circumstances do they do that? And that's really still a mystery.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Dr. Tor Wager for that rundown of what we know about placebo and nocebo effects. Even after having that full conversation, placebo effects are still one of those things that just kind of leave me a little bit befuddled. I feel like we don't really have a real answer to that question, or at least not a general answer to, can you placebo yourself? Can you fool yourself into thinking something is going to have an effect when you know in fact it's an inert substance or a methodology without teeth to it? It sort of reminds me of that famous quote by Henry Ford: if you think you can do a thing or you think you can't do a thing, you're right. So if you believe that you can give yourself a placebo and get real effects out of that, you probably can. And if you're like me and you just kind of don't think you can fool yourself into it, then you probably can't. But as mentioned, their placebo effects are happening all the time, whether we know it or not, and probably particularly when we don't know it. The power of expectation is a really, really powerful force in all of our lives. I would love it if somebody followed up on that idea and did a study to see if the way that optimism correlates with a person's susceptibility to positive placebo, if pessimism has a similar correlation with negative placebo, or if it's just that optimistic people are more suggestible in general. You could kind of see arguments for that in either direction. There probably is a right answer. It would be great to know what that answer actually is. If we get answers later, or if anybody knows of any relevant studies there, definitely let me know and we'll report back in the future. But moving right along, as mentioned, tomorrow is National Hugging Day in the US, and we've got a relevant ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
So a couple of interesting facts about hugs. Hugs are pretty popular. Everybody likes them. There's some people who claim not to be huggers. I suspect that they're lying. I suspect that in their secret heart of hearts, they probably like hugs too. First of all, there's this apparent cross-cultural fact, which has been true in both humans of all ages, races, shapes, sizes, all that stuff, that what we think of as the current now perceptually tends to operate in about 3-second bursts. 3 seconds is what one psychologist says lends the feeling of nowness. In a 1994 study of giraffes, deer, raccoons, pandas, and kangaroos living in zoos, looking at the duration of every move that those animals made from chewing to defecating, the average time burst was about 3 seconds. So there might be some fundamental thing about 3 seconds long. Who knows? I'm a little skeptical because the average had to be something, and maybe 3 seconds is just what it happened to be. But developmental psychologist Emi Snegi of the University of Dundee in the United Kingdom was watching the 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing and started paying particular attention to the length of the hugs of the Olympic competitors as they won events and were hugging their teammates or hugging their coaches, things like that, and started to suspect that the length of hugs followed this 3-second rule. Now, most of the previous studies had been looking at individual actions, things like the aforementioned chewing and defecation, which don't involve another participant, but hugging is this two-person participative activity, and lo and behold, the 3-second rule still applied, so maybe there is something to this 3-second idea after all. But hugs were a little bit longer between the Olympians and their coaches, a little bit less long between Olympians and their competitors, maybe not surprisingly. But anyway, that's not all we have to say about hugs. We've actually got a couple of sources for this National Hugging Day Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick, and the other one is this. So, as you know, cortisol is the stress hormone. It spikes in your bloodstream if you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, or even if you need to wake up in the morning. It's what helps you shake off that sleepy feeling. But too much cortisol, or cortisol over an extended period, is not a good thing. You don't want to always have elevated cortisol levels. And it's been proven in many studies that in addition to things like promoting oxytocin, hugs between people can also reduce cortisol levels. But one of the big ongoing complaints from a lot of sectors about the increasing technologification of society, not sure if that's a word, but you know what I mean, is that even though we have all these great ways of digitally communicating with one another, they are somewhat less personal than the old-fashioned face-to-face means. And so recently researchers looked to see if there was a way of kind of splitting the difference and solving this problem somewhat, still using digital means to communicate, but getting some of that good old person-to-person biochemical feeling that it might not be easy to pick up from a cell phone. They conducted an experiment where people gave blood and saliva samples to determine their baseline levels of cortisol. They waited 5 minutes, then they had a 15-minute conversation using a digital device. Now, some people just talked on a cell phone, after which they gave another blood and saliva sample to see how their cortisol had changed, whereas the second group, the experimental group in this study, had a 15-minute conversation with a non-human robotic kind of doll thing that was huggable. So you can think of this as like a big cell phone meets teddy bear kind of contraption that they could snuggle with during the conversation. And as part of the experimental procedure, at the end of the 15-minute conversation, they gave this thing a hug. Think of this as, again, a big electronic teddy bear. And then these people too had their blood and saliva collected for a second test of their cortisol levels. The experiment revealed a significant reduction in cortisol levels for those who had the conversations with the huggable device as opposed to the cell phone. So while not necessarily as convenient as a phone that slides easily into your pocket, a big big, giant, huggable monstrosity communication device might have some biochemical and psychological benefits if you can't be there in person with whomever it is you're speaking with. The researchers in this study say that this suggests new design directions for interpersonal communication media that might improve social support systems in our modern, highly networked societies. All this information greatly saddens me that I cannot give you a hug through the podcast medium, but if I could, I would. And if anybody wants to send me an effigy of you that I can hug in surrogate, drop me an email. I will give you a mailing address. I am at jesse@smartdrugsmarts.com.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so you have made it to the end of episode number 164. Thank you for hanging out the whole time. As usual, the links to everything that we talked about here will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com/164. If you missed last week's episode, in episode number 163, I spoke with Dr. Dominic D'Agostino about idebenone and some related compounds. And next week in 165, I'm going to be talking about a plant compound with a certain level of notoriety right now. It's actually being reviewed by the DEA to see if this might become a scheduled compound. It's not currently, but it's sort of on a moving legal landscape at the moment. Something called kratom or kratom, depending on who you ask. Super interesting compound being used therapeutically by some people and recreationally by others, which is part of the controversy around it. But anyway, come back for that next week. That'll be next Friday, when I will be back here as usual, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. So until then, have a great week in the meantime, and of course, stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.